The subject of this video is bond ETFs, which I discussed in an earlier video that I will link in the More section below. In this video, I will emphasize some major points and provide more details that each investor needs to consider, in my opinion, when making a decision whether to own a bond fund, either a bond ETF or a bond mutual fund, or instead to buy only or primarily individual bonds. If I lived in a state that taxed corporate bond interest, which is not the case, I would probably not own any or only an immaterial amount in taxable accounts. I would still own them in my Roth IRA accounts. The first consideration is that a bond fund, unlike an individual bond, does not promise to pay par value on a certain date. That is important. When I buy Treasury notes or investment-grade corporate bonds at a discount, which is the case for all that I own now, I know to the penny what my total return will be, with the only proviso being that the issuer fulfills its obligation to pay par value and all interest payments. In other words, the issuer does not go bankrupt. For someone living in a state with a state income tax and wants to rely on treasuries rather than corporate bonds, it is not difficult to create a ladder of U.S. treasuries. Buying at auction and filling gaps with purchases in the secondary market, which is easy to do at the brokers. At least you have some promise that you have a promise that the federal government will pay par value of the bills and notes at maturity. A bond fund makes no such promise and is consequently possible to lose part of your original investment and part of the reinvested dividends due to interest rates rising after a purchase. You can download a tentative auction schedule for Treasury bills, notes, and bonds from the Treasury Department's website. A 2- and 5-year Treasury note will be auctioned on Monday, January 27th. I may buy 2 of the 2-year notes, which have recently become slightly less attractive to me due to the decline in yields in response to the last inflation report, which I view as misguided. Once a treasury is purchased, and if I had to sell prior to maturity, there's a possibility of a loss or gain. The treasury market is very liquid, far more so than the corporate bond market. So selling is not difficult. I do not plan on selling any treasury that I buy. The first step when making a decision whether to own a bond fund or is to look at the performance data of the fund at Morningstar.com. One that you can access as a non-subscriber. Just enter the symbol and click the Performance Information tab. The Treasury ETF that has the worst performance numbers is the PIMCO 25 plus year Treasury Zero Coupon ETF, Treasury ETF, symbol ZROZ, which has a 10-year average annual total return of minus 4%. That's annual average total return of minus 4%. And declined 41.3% in 2022 when long-term interest rates started to rise, which is a double whammy for this ETF, consisting of not only long treasury maturities, but also owning only zero coupon securities that make no interest payments, which makes them more sensitive to changes in interest rates than treasuries that do make interest payments. When combining those two factors, the end result was the 41.3% decline in 2022. TLT, the 20-plus year Treasury ETF that owns treasuries that make interest payments, declined 31.24% in 2022. These Treasury ETFs are not safe under any definition of the word, and investment in them is not a conservative one, in my opinion. At the Morningstar website, the returns shown for 1 year or less is a total return, which includes reinvestment and dividends. The 3, 5, 10, and if available, 15-year data are annual average total returns. No matter what bond fund you own or are considering to buy, the total return numbers are likely to be clearly unsatisfactory even before an adjustment is made for taxes owed when the fund is held in a non-retirement account, and those taxes would be paid on the dividends, and a further downward adjustment for inflation. The objective of this kind of exercise, which can be done quickly, is to acquire the most fundamental information about a bond fund, has owning the fund actually grown the investment to meet your financial objectives after taxes and inflation? That is the relevant number when owned in a taxable account. If the total return is barely positive over the past 5 years, then the real total return adjusted for taxes and inflations will be a negative number. Many will have a negative nominal annual total return over the past 5 years, and that is nominal I'm using as before any adjustment for taxes owed on the dividends or inflation. If the fund owned securities that are taxable by a state, which would include corporate bond funds and preferred stock funds, then in addition to adjusting for the federal income taxes, another downward adjustment to the nominal total return needs to be made for the state taxes paid on the income. I used in that prior video the 7 to 10 year Treasury ETF as an example of what can go wrong with these kind of investments. Morningstar has a 5-star rating on that ETF, which is established compared to other similar funds rather than based on some absolute return that the fund has experienced in the past. If one investor bought IEF 5 years ago and the other placed an equal amount in 3, 6, and 1 year Treasury bills and the 2, 3, 4, and 5 year Treasury notes, rolling them over as the original purchases matured, he would have had the higher average annual total return. That is a very easy question to answer when you look at the Morningstar data, since the average annual total return of IEF, the 7 to 10 year Treasury ETF, was minus 1.65 through January 17, 2025. Now that is an annual average total return with dividends reinvested. The return from individually owned treasuries would be positive at least, with income increasing over the 5 year period as rollovers occur, primarily in the treasury bills and possibly and the 2 and 3 year and 4 year treasury notes one as well. The total return of the IEF, which was annual average for 5 years at minus 1.65%, would become even more negative if federal income taxes had to be paid on the dividends and an adjustment is made for inflation. I have some of the inflation numbers for the past 5 years in the more section below. The foregoing, comparing IEF with owning individual treasuries is a comparative analysis. Neither option may be sufficient and most likely is not for most households to achieve financial goals if if the allocation remains high over considerable periods of time. The nominal returns of the Treasury letter, while positive, are just too low to grow capital that will be needed by most households. At a 4.5% compounded annual rate, and before adjustments for taxes and inflation, it takes 15.7 years for money to double. Most people do not have many 15.7 years available to them where they are earning sufficient amount of money that can be invested after their current and routine living expenses. Before major expenses hit, maybe buying a first home, college education for the kids, retirement expenses, major items like the new roof that I installed last year, or substantial increases in costs for health insurance coverage, car insurance, umbrella insurance, home insurance, which increased over 30% for me last year. And I have not had a claim on any of those. Even the individually owned treasury approach, which when rates are low is not safe when safety is defined as reaching your goals, and the goals can only be achieved with significantly better annual returns. I do not need to grow capital at my age, and consequently being bond heavy is okay for me as part of my capital preservation objective. My current portfolio allocation is not something that I did or would do when I was younger, and I would not be using in any event a bond fund other than as a short-term trade and in small amounts, which I will do, rather than owning individually owned treasuries and corporate bonds, since I live in a state that does not tax the corporate bond interest. That is the end of this video.